The first page is pretty much the same. You got the parties, premises, parking. Now for parking, there is really no difference between the net and the gross lease. You have the unreserved parkings as well as the reserved parking spaces. And this is exactly the same between the net and the modified gross for office. Term is the same, early possession the same, base rent, we've already covered this over and over again many times. And then on the base rent and the money is paid upon execution, you got the base rent, security deposit. Now for you guys that just left the meeting, I don't know if you're coming back. So it's not to sign up and then leave the meeting, okay? So I hope you're planning to come back. Security deposit, parking in terms of the amount and the period. So if you add up A, B, C, and D, this will be the total that is due at the time of signing of the lease. So that means the first check that you receive from, if you're the landlord, that you receive from the tenant will consist of A, B, C, and D. It seems to me, according to this form, the first check does not include 1.6, the operating expense. We mentioned previously that for office space, they don't use CAM charge, but they use operating expense. And because it is a gross lease, I see a big difference between a gross lease and a net lease, which is the 1.6. The 1.6 says lessee's share of operating expense increase. That tells me that the base rent includes the operating expense, unless there has been an increase in the operating expense after the lease becomes effective. So if there is nothing that happened to cause the operating expense to change, the tenant will not get charged for any operating expense increase. However, the base rent pretty much will cover the existing operating expense. That's why this is a gross lease. It should include the operating expense. However, nothing prevents the landlord from charging the tenant for any increase in the operating expense. That's why this is a modified gross and not a gross. Because if it is a gross, the landlord cannot come back and charge the tenant any extra due to any increase in the operating expense. Okay, so keep that in mind. So modified gross, the tenant pays for the basic rent, the base rent, plus existing operating expense that's already included in the base rent. So unless there's a change in the operating expense, there will be no separate charge to the tenant for operating expense because it is included in the base rent. Agreed use, insuring party. The base year insuring party. The base year is the year in which the lease begins. So subsequently, there's an increase in the insurance premium. Most likely, that increase will be reflected in the operating expense. That's why you need to indicate the base year here. So in this case, if you're signing this in 2017, then the base year is 2017. And it says here the insuring party is the lessor. Who's the lessor? The lessor is the landlord. As with all the other air forms make the lessor the insuring party. Representation's the same. Go ahead and put in your listing broker's name as well as the leasing broker's name right here. Okay, and payment to brokers, the same thing. If you want to keep it private and not let the tenant know how much you're getting in terms of your commission, you do it by way of a separate written agreement. However, if you don't mind the information being made public to the tenant, you can state it here. So the tenant would know how much you're making in terms of commission. But you have to pick one or the other and not do any of them, because you do need a written agreement. It can be a separate written agreement, or it can be part of the lease agreement. I generally prefer that it be a separate written agreement. But if there isn't any, you can go ahead and put it in here. Usually for a commercial lease, if the lessee is a company, we usually require a guarantor, okay? Business hours for the building. You go ahead and put in, this is the same as the net lease. You go ahead and put in the business hours. And just like the net lease for office, you have janitorial service possibly. And then lessor supply services, if it includes electricity, go ahead and put that one in there. But if because this is a modified gross, so the more likely than not, the modified gross, sometimes we call that the full service. If it's a full service lease, landlord will pay for electricity, gas, all the utilities. And oftentimes the landlord does not, of course the landlord does not pay for telephone bills, but they will cover most likely the electricity and the gas and all the utilities. Letting, this we covered before, so we will not cover again. Anything that I skip, it means we covered it before, because by now we would have covered most of it. And the common area definition, this will be the same as in the case of a net lease, okay? Same definition. There's really no difference. The only difference I told you before, which was that the base rent will cover the operating expenses. However, it does not cover any increase in the operating expense that the landlord suffers. So initially, the base rent covers the operating expense, but subsequently, if there is any increase in the operating expense, that will be passed to the tenant. Term, the same thing as before. We are not going to cover it again. And operating expense increase, let's talk about that. 4.2. Lessee shall pay to lessor during the term hereof, in addition to the base rent, lessee's share of the amount by which all operating expenses for each comparison year exceeds the amount of all operating expenses for the base year, such excess being thereafter referred to as the operating expense increase in accordance with the following provisions. What this means is, if there is no inflation, if the operation is such that the operating expense has been the same throughout the term of the lease, then the tenant will never have to pay for any increase in the operating expense because the base rent would have covered it. However, there may be things that might cause the operating expense to increase. And the definition for base year is already specified in paragraph 1.9. Usually, the base year is the year in which the tenant signs the lease. If the tenant signs the lease in 2017, then the base year shall be 2017. Comparison year is defined as each calendar year during the term of this lease subsequent to the base year. So, if you sign the lease in 2017, making 2017 the base year, then 2018 will be the first comparison year. But there is nothing that prevents you from making 2016 the base year either. If you sign the lease in 2017 and the landlord makes 2016 the base year, then 2017 shall be the first comparison year. Because if you sign the lease on January 1st, 2017, and the landlord makes 2016 the base year for comparison purposes, then everything shall be compared to what's happening in 2016. So 2017 shall be the first comparison year. Okay? So that's all negotiable. So if 2017 is the base year, then the comparison year shall be 2018. Okay? Now, comparison year is defined as each calendar year during the term of this lease subsequent to the base year. So, provided, however, lessee shall have no obligation to pay a share of the operating expense increase applicable to the first 12 months of the lease term, other than such as are mandated by governmental authority, as to which government-mandated expenses lessee shall pay lessee's share, notwithstanding they occur during the first 12 months. You know what this means? This means is, if your lease starts on January 1st, 2017, then according to this provision, the first 12 months, basically, you will not have to pay for any increase in operating expense in the first 12 months of the lease. It says here, lessee shall have no obligation to pay a share of the operating expense increase applicable to the first 12 months of the lease. However, it has an exception. If the increase is due to some governmental mandate, in other words, the government forces the landlord to do certain things that cause the operating expense to increase during the first 12 months of the lease. In that situation, the tenant shall be responsible for the tenant's share. Of course, I think tenant's share is related to the square footage occupied by the tenant relative to the total square footage of the project. That's what they mean by tenant's share. Okay? And then it says here, lessee's share of the operating expense increase for the first and last comparison year of the lease term shall be prorated according to that portion of such comparison year as to which lessee is responsible for a share of such increase. What this means is, let's say instead of signing the lease on January 1st, 2017, the signing date is June 1st, 2017. So we say that in the first 12 calendar months, there shall be no increase in the operating expense. But since we use the comparison year in terms of 12 months in a comparison year, sometimes you may have to prorate. For example, if you sign your lease on June 1st, 2017, there shall be no increase attributable to the first 12 calendar months. So in the first comparison year of 2018, we only have 6 months. So, the increase shall be prorated. And then in the last year, it shall be prorated as well. If you sign like a 5-year lease, right? In the last year, your lease will probably end, I don't know, but maybe the first half of the year. So for the first and the last year, it's prorated because it's you don't occupy the full 12 months. Okay. All right. Now let's talk about the operating expenses. What are the things that can be included in the operating expenses? I suspect that this one has the same definition as the one in the multi-tenant office net lease. Today we're talking about modified gross lease. Now let's find out if they are the same or they are the different. It appears to me they are the same because the operating expenses, the items that are included in the operating expenses would include, number one, costs relating to the operation, repair, and maintenance in neat, clean, safe, good order and condition, but not the replacement of the following. The common area, it's the same. Heating, air conditioning, plumbing, electrical systems, life safety equipment, communication, blah, blah, blah. Those are the same. All other areas and improvements that are within the exterior boundaries of the project are outside of the premises occupied by the tenant, the same as in the net lease. And the cost of trash disposal, janitorial and security services, pest control services, same as in the net lease. Cost of any other services to be provided by lessor that is elsewhere in the lease, stated to be an operating expense, same as in the net lease. Cost of the premiums of the insurance policies maintained by lessor pursuant to paragraph 8 and any deductible portion of any insured loss concerning the building or the common area, the same as in the net lease. The amount of the real property taxes payable by lessor pursuant to paragraph 10, the same as in the net lease. Cost of water, sewer, gas, electricity, and other publicly mandated services not separate metered, same as in the net lease. Labor, salaries, and applicable fringe benefits and cost, material, supplies, and tools used in maintaining and or cleaning the project, and accounting and management fees, the same as in the net lease. The last item, the cost of any capital improvement to the building or the project not covered under the provisions of paragraph 2.3, provided, however, that lessor shall allocate the cost of any such capital improvement over a 12-year period, and lessee shall not be required to pay more than lessee's share of 1/144th of the cost of such capital expenditure in any given month, the same as in the net lease. And then number 9 is the same, 10 is the same. So as you can see, the definition of operating expense is identical between the net lease of the multi-tenant office lease and the modified gross version of the multi-tenant office lease. And again, the only difference that we've seen between a net multi-tenant office lease and a modified gross multi-tenant office lease is in the base rent. In the case of a modified gross, the base rent includes the original operating expense. It does not include any operating expense increase. Whereas in the case of net lease, the tenant gets a base rent, a bill for base rent, but the tenant also gets a separate bill for operating expense, regardless of whether there's increase or no increase. So you have a separate charge for operating expense if it's a net lease, but you do not get a separate charge for the operating expense if it's a modified gross lease, unless there's an increase in the operating expense. Okay, so that seems to be the only difference so far. We'll skip this. Hazardous substances we covered before, so we're skipping that. Okay. And lessee's compliance with applicable requirements, we cover that. Inspection compliance covered. Maintenance, repair, utility, installation, trade fixtures, alterations, we covered. Ownership, removal, surrender, restoration, we've already covered that, so we'll skip it. Insurance and indemnity, it's all previously covered. Anything to do with insurance is all previously covered. So we'll skip it. And then the, what I call the damage or destruction, previously covered, so we'll skip it. This provision is actually identical for pretty much all of the AIR standard leases. So we can cover that. Todd has a question. Why don't you go ahead and raise it again? Sometimes I don't see your chat. So. Abatement of rent, we covered that, so we will skip it right before. Real property taxes, I think we covered it, but I will talk about it again. Because it is always important to find out who's paying for the property taxes. It seems that lessor is always the one paying for the property taxes. The only question is whether or not the property taxes get transferred to the tenant or not. So here it says, except as otherwise provided in paragraph 10.3, lessor shall pay the real property taxes applicable to the project, and said payment shall be included in the calculation of operating expenses in accordance with the provision of paragraph 4.3. Now we gather that in every year the property tax will go up. So you know whether or not other expenses cause the operating expense to increase. For sure, there's one expense that always causes the property operating expense to increase. That will be the property tax. So every year, the tenant is going to get a bill. If not from anywhere else, it's from the real property tax, the additional real property tax the landlord is paying. So for sure, for each comparison year, there will be an increase in the operating expense. So the tenant should not be surprised about getting a bill from the landlord about the operating expense increase due to increase in property tax. Because this one does, the 10.2 does say that the payment shall be included in the calculation of operating expenses. So each year there will be an increase. So this is a modified gross. For modified gross, tenant is still responsible for operating expense increase. All right, skip the rest because we covered them. Utilities and services already covered. Now let's talk about assignment and subletting. I don't think we covered assignment and subletting. All right, 12.1. It says, 12.1a, lessee shall not voluntarily or by operation of law assign, transfer, mortgage, or encumber, collectively assign or assignment, or sublet all or part of lessee's interest in this lease or in the premises without lessor's prior written consent. This is, in many cases, the law as well as the contract. A tenant is not supposed to assign the lease to someone else without the landlord's prior written consent. What does prior written consent mean? So if you have been approached by someone to purchase your business, as part of the purchase, they need to receive assignment of the lease. And in order for them to properly receive assignment of the lease, you, the seller, needs to write to the landlord to inform the landlord that you are selling your business, and you are interested in assigning your lease to the buyer who will be the new owner for the business, and you want the landlord's written consent. Okay, that's what you need to do. And whether or not the landlord will give you the consent will depend on many things, and we'll look at those things. Look at B. Unless lessee is a corporation and its stock is publicly traded on a national stock exchange, a change in the control of lessee shall constitute an assignment requiring consent. So if you are a tenant, you are not a publicly traded company, and if there has been change in the control, usually control means more than 50% of the stock has been transferred to someone else, that will trigger a written consent for the lease to be assigned to the corporation. I guess, I mean, it's not, they don't require a change in the paperwork because it's still the same corporation, but it still requires a written consent from the landlord. If the tenant wants to transfer greater than 51% or greater of the, well, actually, this one actually not 51%, it's even worse than that. I think it's something like 25%. Yeah, 25% will trigger it. You don't even need 51%. Okay, it says here, the transfer on a cumulative basis of 25% or more of the voting control of lessee shall constitute a change in control of this business. So even a 25% transfer will require the landlord's consent. Okay. The involvement of lessee or his assets in any transaction or series of transactions by way of merger, sale, acquisition, financing, transfer, leverage, buyout, or otherwise, whether or not a formal assignment or hypothecation of this lease or the lessee's assets occurs, which will result in a reduction of the net worth of lessee by an amount greater than 25% of such net worth as it was represented at the time of the execution of the lease or the time of the most recent assignments to which the lessor has consented, or as it exists immediately prior to said transaction or transaction constituting such reduction, whichever was or is greater, shall be considered an assignment of this lease to which the lessor may withhold its consent. What that means is that if you're going to use the company's stock as collateral to borrow money, and if it will cause the net worth of the company to be reduced by 25% or greater, it will trigger an assignment, and because it triggers an assignment, that will require the landlord's consent. So do not transfer greater than 25% or use greater than 25% of your net worth as a collateral when you borrow money. If you do, it means it's something that requires the landlord's consent. Okay? Now, we don't normally pay attention to this, but this is actually in the air agreement. Okay? It's good that you're learning this, so next time you know. Okay? And then on D, it says, an assignment or sublet dealing without consent shall, at the source option, be a default curable after notice per paragraph 13.1D or a non-curable breach without the necessity of any notice and grace period. What that means is that if you go out and transfer greater than 25% interest in the property to someone else, that is a change of control of 25% or greater. That requires the landlord's consent. If you do so without landlord's consent, that is a breach. It's a default, and it could result in termination of the lease. For example, it says here, lessor may either terminate this lease or upon 30 days written notice, increase the monthly base rent to 110% of the base rent then effect. So whenever you have a unauthorized assignment, the landlord has a choice of terminating the lease or increase the base rent by 10%. Okay? Increase the base rent to 110%, which means the same thing as increase the base rent by 10%. Okay? And then if you it says here, if further in the event such breach and rental adjustment, the purchase price of any option to purchase the premises held by the lessee shall be subject to similar adjustment to 110% of the price previously in effect. Now, if you happen to have an option to purchase from the landlord and you have an unauthorized assignment, the landlord is able to charge you 10% extra on the purchase price when you exercise the option to purchase, if you have an unauthorized assignment. Okay? All right? And then it says here, and all fixed and non-fixed rental adjustment scheduled during the remainder of the lease term shall be increased 110% of the scheduled adjusted rent. That means that everything is adjusted by 10% extra if you have an unauthorized assignment. Okay? So that's important to know. And then it says here, lessee's remedy for any breach of paragraph 12.1 above by lessor shall be limited to compensatory damages or injunctive relief. Okay? And it says landlord may withhold consent to a proposed assignment or subletting if lessee is in default at the time the consent is requested. So if you have been behind on your rent and you want to sell your business and you ask the landlord to approve the assignment of the lease to the buyer, the landlord may withhold consent until you pay the rent amounts that are in arrears. If you don't, they can withhold consent. Notwithstanding the foregoing, allowing a de minimis portion of the premises, i.e. 20 square feet or less, to be used by a third-party vendor for installation, vending machine, or payphone shall not constitute subletting. So if the square footage that is being used by someone else, it's so small, such that it's less than 20 square feet, then it is not a subletting. So you don't have to worry about the landlord. Okay?
But it is permitted.
Yeah, you don't need consent. For example, you want a vending machine there, you don't need the landlord's consent. Okay? Because technically when you let somebody use that space for a vending machine, it is a sublease. Especially you're charging the vending machine company for rent. That is a sublease, right? But because it is less than 20 square feet, it does not require the landlord's consent. Because you can actually have a sublease to a vending machine company without going through the landlord. That's right. Terms and conditions applicable to assignment and subletting. Okay, let's talk about that. These are important actually. Regardless of lessor's consent, no assignment or subletting shall be effective without the express written assumption by such assignee or assignee or sublessee of the obligations of lessee under this lease. All that means is, even if they approve the assignment or sublease, they want to make the assignee, who is the new buyer or someone to whom you assign the lease, assume the lease. Okay? And then it says here, release the lessee of any obligations hereunder. Okay? What that means is, if you are a lessee, you're looking to assign, such as in the sale of a business, you are not off the hook though, because if the new buyer does not pay the rent, you are still on the hook, because it says here, no assignment shall release the lessee of any obligations hereunder. So even if you sell your business, you are still on the hook. if the buyer does not pay the rent that they're supposed to pay. Okay. And then it says here, or 3, alter the primary liability of lessee for the payment of rent or the performance of any other obligations to be performed by the lessee. What that means is you are still primarily liable. So this is actually quite interesting because unless otherwise specified, whenever there is an assignment, usually the lessee is secondarily liable. But according to the AIR agreement, even in an assignment, the lessee is still primarily liable. So in other words, they can still look to the lessee for payment. Okay? All right, and then it says here, lessor may accept rent or performance of lessee's obligations for any person other than lessee pending approval or disapproval of an assignment. Neither a delay in the approval or disapproval of such assignment, nor the acceptance of rent or performance shall constitute a waiver or estoppel of lessor's right to exercise its remedies for lessee's default or breach. What that means is, although the new tenant might be paying rent already, but in the meantime, they still have not given the written approval yet. It doesn't mean that they cannot change their mind and say, all right, your request is disapproved, and then they can just go ahead and refund the previously received rent payments, and then your buyer still does not get the lease. Okay, that's all it means. And I'm not gonna go through the rest of it. If you want, you can read it yourself. Okay. However, there's one important thing I want to tell you though, which is G here. It says, lessor's consent to any assignment or subletting shall not transfer to the assignee or sublessee any option granted to the original lessee by this lease unless such transfer is specifically consented to by lessor in writing. You know what this really means? Let's say, for example, you are the listing agent for a tenant who's trying to sell his business, right? And you get this lease, and it has 2 5-year options, all right? Now, when you find a buyer to buy this business, this buyer wants to take advantage of the 2 5-year option. That has to be negotiated. If you do not take care of that, this buyer comes on, buys the business, finish the original term of the lease expecting to have 2 5-year options. He doesn't have any. You got to take care of it right there and then. So in other words, there must be paperwork prepared.
She told me she wrote the check yesterday, but she wasn't home until.
Okay, make sure you mute yourself. You're gonna start talking, right? Or else you're disturbing the entire group here. Okay. I saw you talking, Laura. Okay. All right. Quit talking so we can finish it here. Okay. So what I'm saying is that the important part about the options, you got to pay attention to options, because if you don't do it right, the new buyer doesn't have the options, and he's going to be very upset when the landlord tells him that he doesn't have any option. Okay, got to be careful about that. All right, because options would have to be negotiated with the landlord. When you get the landlord's consent, make sure you get the landlord to let this new buyer assume the options. It's not automatic. According to the AIR agreement, it is not automatic. Okay? Make sure you get it right and don't screw up on something like that. Okay? All right. But of course, this is an office lease. Even an office lease sometimes has options like this, right? I think it's more common in like strip mall, like commercial leases. where you have like 2 5-year options for 10 years. If you're a buyer, you want to make sure you get that taken care of. Okay, especially if you represent the buyer. You want to take care of that. All right, the rest of it, you know what? We can skip, and because many of that we already covered previously, actually. So I think that pretty much concludes today's training. And in summary, there is really not much difference between the net multi-tenant office lease and modified gross multi-tenant office lease. The only difference is in the modified gross, the base rent includes all operating expenses already, except for any subsequent increase in operating expense, which most likely will be due primarily to an increase in the property tax. Whereas in the net lease, the base rent does not include the operating expense. The operating expense is added as a separate charge. That's really the only difference, okay?